Guys, this is that perfect example of that thanks I made it moment. And if you want to say that too, then this tutorial is for you. And for those that want the paper pattern, it is in my Etsy. So we obviously want to start out by cutting our fabric according to the pattern. That will be an inner fabric and an outer fabric as well as batting, but you're always going to want to leave that batting a little bit longer. And you're also going to want to cut out the fabric that's for your ruffles too. I use a hair marker to help me achieve quilting straight lines. I basically make an indentation as kind of my first reference point, and after I've sewn over that crease, I'll then use the guide bar. So quilt however you want. I chose to do diamonds. Then you're going to trim off all the excess batting. Then we can move on to making our ruffles. Start off by sewing the ends together. If your fabric had a pattern, you'd be putting the right sides together, and this part is just necessary to make our edges look a little cleaner. And after that's flipped out, go ahead and fold that fabric in half. Now want the pretty or the right sides of the fabric facing out. Go ahead and pin those together. And I have a whole tutorial on how to make ruffles, but short story is you're going to turn your tension all the way up to 9, and also your stitch length up to 5. Then you're just going to sew your edges, and the machine does all the work for you. Don't backstitch at the start or the end though, because you do want to keep your thread tails as long as possible to adjust the ruffles if you need to. Then go ahead and fold your outer fabric in on itself, lining the very bottom with that little notch. It's almost towards the top. This area that I'm marking will end up being the bottom of the kindle case, and I mark it so that I can identify where my ruffles will start and end. At this point, go ahead and test your ruffle length, starting and ending where we just made those 2 marks as your start and end reference point. If for some reason your ruffles are too short or too long, then that's why we've left our thread tails really long so that we can readjust. Then I go ahead and clip everything into place. I do use pins to secure the little notch area, and that area is basically separating the body from the little envelope flap. And then I also use pins for the corners. Super important to make sure that you're kind of folding the fabric in on itself so that you're only sewing over the edges and not the long part of the ruffle. I also think it's a good idea to kind of keep some of that edge of the ruffle hanging over the outer fabric, and that's to avoid the stitch of the ruffling poking out when we turn everything right side out. And when you finish that tedious task, you will place the inner lining directly on top of the outer fabric. Here I'll add more clips to the bottom and then readjust some of the upper ones to include the inner lining. And now we will sew all around the edges, making sure to leave a hole at the bottom so that we can turn everything right side out later on. So sew around the edges as you normally would. Big thing here is just keeping an eye out for those 2 little notches. I do turn it right side out just to give it a glance over before I go back in, turn it inside out, and cut off some of that excess fabric that we left hanging over the side. But when you're done with that, go ahead and turn it right side out and sew a line over the hole that we left at the bottom. Okay, now take the end that doesn't have any ruffles and fold that in, pretty sides facing each other. Tuck that ruffle in between. The most important part here is that you're folding the fabric right where the end of that ruffle is. If yours looks like this, then I would go ahead and clip it to make sure everything stays right where you want it to. Then go ahead and sew down the sides. This part can be a little tricky. Also, I do recommend sewing from the top end right here versus the bottom end, because if your foot is at that great of an angle, it does not want to go. So finish sewing down this side, and then you're going to repeat the same process on the other side. Then you can pull your fabric out, and it starts to get exciting because it feels like you're almost there. So about 3/4 of an inch up from the ruffle, and this whole piece should be about 6 inches. So in the middle is 3. I'll mark with my fabric marker to know where to place my buttonhole. Theoretically, you'd place a button right here. I just chose to make it 1/2 of an inch. Then you just place the foot on your machine, bring down this little lever, but it does need to be in between this space. I then set my machine to this stitch, and honestly, the machine does all the work for you. Really, the hardest part about this is just making sure that you're lining the starting point up at the right spot. And then I place pins at the beginning and end of the button stitches before I use my seam ripper to open up that fabric. Those pins being there save you from going too far. And you do want to be cautious of how big you make your buttonhole, aka don't go too much bigger, because I fear that the whole bow could slip out. Now I used a satin ribbon for this part, and overall it's 22 inches, 11 inches each way. I cut it at an angle, and I'm not going to tell you to burn your edges because I'm a little nervous you're going to catch it on fire. I don't know, go find an adult before you do this. But this is what I did. And that's to avoid the possibility of my ends fraying. Anyways, then you're gonna line up the middle of that ribbon to where your buttonhole is. There's definitely gonna be variation depending on where you placed your buttonhole. It doesn't really matter, but mine was about 7/8 of an inch down. Pin that into place and then sew just a line right down the middle. And after you sew that, that's really it. Go ahead and place your Kindle in and you've got yourself a Kindle cover. And I will say it would make a pretty good gift because